Welcome to Roots of Faith Ancestry. I'm Renee Richard, and I have with me Judy Riffle and Leonard Smith III. And today we'll be speaking on vital records, namely civil vital records. And let me just define quickly what a vital record is. This is a record that is generated that documents the key events in a person's life. So there are birth records, marriage records, death records, possibly even divorce records that would be considered vital records. We're going to concentrate on birth and death, and they're going to be civil vital records, which means that they are government or state controlled. And there are laws that influence how we record and how we access these records. But the records for genealogists, they're not created for them. We mentioned that in earlier shows, but we love to use them. And the reason for that is because they provide so much genealogy information in them for us to plug into that family tree and for us to plug into those family group sheets that we talked about in our previous shows. So in light of the laws that we have about them, I'm going to ask Judy to talk a little bit about some of those laws.
Thank you, Renee. Well, Louisiana's laws requiring births and deaths be recorded actually date back to the early 1800s. The problem is they were only mandatory in the city of New Orleans. So when something's not mandatory, usually it doesn't get recorded. So that's why we have so few birth and death records, civil birth and death records, outside of the city of New Orleans. We do have some. They're scattered in various parishes that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Also, in the 1870s, the cities of Baton Rouge and Shreveport started requiring that birth and deaths be recorded. And this was mainly for health reasons because of all the epidemics they were having at that time. And then finally, around 1900, the state started tightening the laws requiring births and deaths to be recorded. And even then, there'll be some that were missed. Either there wasn't a doctor around to record the birth or death, or they just never got around to filing it. So that's why we have so few births and deaths outside of New Orleans for the 19th century.
And we have to also look, now these are the laws that came about, them creating the records that we want to use. But now we want to look at the laws concerning access of these records. The records have been created and they're in the Vital Office Registry, I believe is where they're located when they're first created. And then they put in laws that limit when we can actually go and dig the information up, to say it better. So Judy's going to tell us a little bit more about how we access those.
Right. Well, every state is different. In Louisiana, the law is that a birth must be over 100 years old and a death over 50 years old before it's public. And every year, the Vital Records Office in New Orleans will send 1 year's worth of records to the Louisiana State Archives in Baton Rouge, where they process them and make them available to the public. Births less than 100 years old and deaths less than 50 years old remain private in New Orleans, and there are rules and laws governing who has access and who can get copies of those records.
Right. I know, for instance, if it's your own birth certificate, you can get it, and if it's your children's or your parents' direct line, but you have to show your proof for that. And we may be able to post some information for researchers with what that is entailed at the end of our show here. So Leonard, I believe, is going to show us now some examples actually of death certificates, and they do vary depending on whether they're a state one or a New Orleans one too.
That's correct. Actually, the state of Louisiana actually has a great site that we can use it's the Secretary of State site, and the URL is sos.la.gov. We'll actually put that on the end of the show as well. And what we can do is actually search all vital records from the state, the death records, birth records, and of course the Orleans Parish marriage records. What's so nice about it is that a lot of technology have come our way in the world of genealogy that we can actually do a lot of at-home research, which is great, before you make those trips to the courthouses or to the state archives. So the example I had given earlier before is that I actually had my great-grandfather, Andrew Brown, and I knew a little bit about Andrew Brown because of oral history, but didn't know all the details of how he lived, where he lived. Basically, I knew that he had died because I went to the tombstone and actually saw the death on there. And of course, that's not always etched in stone, no pun intended, but But what's good about it is that it gave me a reference. And so I actually went to the State Archives site and actually typed in Andrew Brown. I knew that he was in Lafourche Parish, so I was able to sort him or look him up because of the Lafourche Parish. And what I came up with was a reference number that gave me information on how I can retrieve that information for him. And I ended up having to go to the State Archives to actually get the actual death certificate, but at least I had a reference, so when I made my field trip, I actually had information. I didn't have to look it up there on microfilm. So to give you an example, what's on here is that there's a state file number, which is something you want to record. It has his full name, Andrew Brown. He did not have a middle name. The date of death, and also the time when he actually passed, which is a good reference as well. It gives his sex, his color, his race is colored. He's widowed. His wife is unknown, which I did know that his wife name, but they had been divorced a while. But he actually lived to be in 1950. She died in 1937. Also, they have a estimated, and I'm going to say estimated because it's not quite right, his birth date. And so it gets back to who actually gave the information, which we will cover a little further down. But actually, the deceased was born here, says December 1873. Age when he was deceased was 77 years. Birthplace, Lafourche Parish. So far, probably about 90% correct on everything that I know of so far. They actually say that his occupation, old age pension. So I guess that was his income, but I also knew that he was a moss picker from the census that we had seen before. Had never served in the armed forces. The place of death was St. John Community, which is right next to the property that he lived, and that's where he's buried at in that cemetery. How long did he live in that area? They say life, and that's correct. Also, they mention another unusual residence, another residence that he may have had. It's still St. John Thibodeau. Now, one of the most important pieces that I always like to find on the death records are parents. And actually, his parents are listed here. And it's Charles Brown, and his mother is Mary Brown. Of course, Mary Brown not being her maiden name, but at least I know her first name is Mary. And the next line gives me the informant information. Now, I do not know this person, have never seen this person in any of the other documents. So, Jenkins Stone, and the signature is signed 12/16/50. So that would be something I would want to research and actually say, well, okay, who is Jefferson Stone? How would they know this information? And so forth, like I say, most of it is correct. Now, the cause of death, which is very important, it gives good information on if he actually had an illness and it worked up into his death, then you can always have that. That's always referenced as well. But in this case, I'm going to refer this over to my medical expert on actually what he died of. Renee, if you don't mind.
Yes. And some of these records do give valid medical terminology. Some of them give an antiquated, but you can still Google it or look in a medical book. But it says here carcinoma of the stomach, which would be stomach cancer. But sometimes it'll give another condition that exists. In this case, it says ascites. And just being a nurse, we still use that term. As a matter of fact, we use both of these terms. And ascites is fluid buildup in the abdomen. Okay. So in today's world, we would tap it and remove it. In his world, that could have complicated the death, made it faster.
Okay, okay. But it also has date of operation. So if there was an operation involved, it says 0. So that's important as well. Also, they mentioned if there was an autopsy, if it was an accident, a suicide, all that is indicated on this record. So it's a very good record for genealogy research. It also has the certification from the physician when he signed off on it. Also, and this is a good one that a lot don't have, but it actually have the funeral director certification and the cemetery where he would be buried at, which, in case it's true, is St. John's Cemetery. So this is, to me, I find that the certificate of death is the most important document I can start with. And I always start, being a genealogist, we always start from the last document. Technically, this is his last document on earth, if you think of it that way. So I like to start from there and work my way back. So we actually have a couple other statewide that we actually can research as well. Everyone knows about Bonnie and Clyde. And I use that one as an example because sometimes when you you've actually worked with your family tree for a while and you want to do a little something off the beaten path, it's always good to maybe just pull a celebrity out of the air and see if you can find information on them, especially if they died in Louisiana. Of course, we know that Bonnie and Clyde was not from Louisiana, but that's where they were originally from, Dallas, the Texas area. So I actually went back to the Secretary of State site and went to SOS and actually came up with, I knew the parish was Bienville, but I didn't use the parish this time, just got one of the variation. So I actually just put in Clyde Barrow. First name Clyde, last name Barrow. And of course, he was the only one that was there. It also, because of the results of the, on the database itself, it actually shows you that, and I know we'll have this on the screen, but it says that the year was 1934, and it mentioned that he, there's an order number, which is the page number, and the volume number, which is what you would actually look in the courthouse, I mean the state archives, to actually pull that record. And the parish is Bienville. And what I found here was that this record looks a little different from the one that I actually previously had, because this is 1934, so things are a little different, but it's a Clyde Chestnut Barrow. Residence is Dallas, Texas. He's male, white, single, age 24. Now, I always thought that they were much older than that because of all what they had done in that little time, but he was only 24 years old when he actually died. And they actually had his occupation as glass. It could be blower or cutter. It's actually scratched out, so that would be something I would probably want to look into. There's also a coroner's inquest, which is another document that you can actually look up in the courthouses when you actually go there. But of course, the cause of death is gunshot wounds. Okay, so we know about that. Also, the date that he last worked at the occupation was 1929 as the glass cutter, and total time spent in that occupation was 4 years. So maybe on the side, in between the bank robberies, maybe he actually did a little work on the side. But anyway, his birthplace is Ellis County, Texas. His father's name is Henry B. Barrow, and his birthplace, now that's a good one there. It actually gives the birthplace of his father, which is also Ellis County, Texas. And then the mother's name is a Connie Walker, but she was actually born in a Natchitoches, is what it's saying here. And it says Natchitoches County. So that, I guess that's probably in Texas, I would think. Okay. Informant was E.W. Barrow. So that means that good chance that was a relative that actually gave the information. And of course, there's the undertaker information in his file. And then they also had a, where he was actually killed at. And it was killed by officers, Bienville Parish, public highway. That's how it's noted. So that was actually Clyde. Now, we also have Bonnie. Same thing, I did Bonnie Parker because I knew the name. But there was other Bonnie Parkers that came up as well. It wasn't just Bonnie Parker in Bienville. There was one in LaSalle and one was in Acadia. But the Bonnie Parker that came up, she was actually married, which I didn't know, but separated. Roy Thornton was the husband. She was 23. Also Texas. Father name was Charlie Parker from Texas. And the mother name was Emma Krause. And she's from Texas as well. The informant was H.N. Parker, and he actually gave a street address, 232 West State Street, Dallas. Now, I like, when I get addresses like that, I actually like to go on Google Maps and actually pull that up and see exactly where it is, and maybe the house may still be there. So if you're telling the story, especially if you're doing a documentary, that would be some good fill piece that you could use. Gunshot wounds is the reason why of the deceased, killed by officers, and it's same handwriting from the previous one, so I'm assuming that it was the same coroner and the same, actually it's the same doctor that actually wrote it all.
God of gracious love, you gathered us first at the waters of baptism, and you lead us through life with faithfulness. As once you formed us as a diocese of Baton Rouge, So now, Lord God, do for us again something new. Raise up from among our families and friends leaders to serve your people as priests, sisters, brothers, deacons, and lay ministers. To those to whom you call, give grace and courage to discern how they may best serve you. To us all, give good hearts so that we may encourage them along the way. May we live to see the fruitfulness of our longing, walking with you, O God, into a future filled with hope. We ask this through Jesus Christ and with your Holy Spirit, now and forever. Amen.
Do you need a little light in your life? Tune in to the next episode of Beacons of Light, where we'll share the story of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul in action, serving God's poor and homeless. We'll share stories of our volunteers and our supporters, making the gospel come to life for those in need.
God's way is my way, God's shield is around.
Watch our programming on demand anytime at CatholicLifeTV.org.
One of the least noticed works of art here in the cathedral are our magnificent mosaic Stations of the Cross. That's probably because they're between our magnificent stained glass windows. You notice the windows because they're all lit up, and the stations are not quite as bright. But they are exquisite. Notice that they're mosaics made up of thousands of pieces of tile and precious stone. They were put in the 1920s. They were fashioned in Germany. This particular station is the first station. You can see Pontius Pilate and a Roman soldier flanking Jesus, who was being condemned to death. Especially in Lent, the Stations of the Cross inspire so many people to be resolute in following Christ and even taking up their own personal crosses to follow him. Here at the cathedral, as in any Catholic church, we invite you to encounter Christ, to become more closely related to him in prayer. Visit the cathedral, the mother church of the Diocese of Baton Rouge, and you'll be greatly spiritually rewarded.
Welcome back. Just before break, Leonard was going over Bonnie and Clyde's death certificates, and that was quite enjoyable for me to see. And you have one more example that you wanted to give us, so I'll let you tell us about it, because it's a little bit different.
Yeah, this one is a little different because it actually is based in New Orleans. And of course, what's nice about the state site, you can actually pull New Orleans records as well, especially Louisiana death records, so it covers the whole parish. And I actually just put a known name in New Orleans. There was a school called L.B. Landry, and I always wanted to know what the B stands for, but it was Beaconsfield. And what I found is that if I just put in L. Landry, which would probably be a very common name, just to see what would come up. And actually there was 422 results came up for L. Landry. But of course, Beaconsfield was not a common middle name, and that came to the top. So I was able to pull his record. And a little bit about Lord Beacon Landry. He was a physician. He was a civics leader and civilist. He was born in Donaldsonville in 1878. His father, Pierre Landry, was the first black mayor of Donaldsonville. He also received his elementary education in Donaldsonville and later completed high school at Gilbert Academy in Baldwin, Louisiana. He also received a BA in 1902 from the Fritz University, where he was a member of the Fritz Jubilee Singers that went around the country. And he actually taught until 1904 when he enrolled at Meharry Medical School. And from there, he ended up with an MD degree in 1908, returned to New Orleans to practice in Algiers. And what's interesting about his story is that in his death certificate, in fact, was the fact that he actually died, and it's a little different. It's a different, and I know we'll have this on the screen, but I know you can't see it as well. But they actually have the undertaker information, and they give the undertaker's address, which I always thought Orleans was kind of unique with that. But they also have here that L. Beaconfield Landry, colored, a native of Donaldsonville, Louisiana, age 54, departed this life yesterday on the 21st of January, 1934, at Flint Goodrich Hospital in New Orleans. And he also gave his address, which was 422 Newton Street. Of course, that would be another Google search that I would look up on maps and actually pull up. Maybe the house is still there, because it helps to tell the story. And again, here's one that I thought was of interest, and I'm going to refer this one to my medical expert as well on what he had, the cause of death.
Let's see, where is it? Oh, okay. Infected hand, traumatic septic nephritis. So he had an infection on his hand that went into his entire system, and the infection went to his kidneys and his heart.
Okay. So the story that I've always heard was he actually died of blood poisoning.
That's true.
That's true. Okay. So there's actually someone actually writing a book right now on his story, and I know that that is being mentioned. But what also here is that he was deceased. He was married, a physician, and the son of Pierre Landry and Amanda Gisby, natives of Louisiana, which is great because now they're giving the maiden name of his mother, which is always great. And like I say, it's a wealth of information that you can get from the death certificates, and it actually always gives you that next generation back, which is most important.
Thank you. And you know, a lot of what we've been talking about here concerning the birth and death records in the 19th century has dealt with New Orleans because they were mandated there. So just to give you an idea, there are pockets of records that exist for other areas of the state, and some of these are in periodicals. If this Judy wrote the book for the guide for the state archives, but in this book, if you look in there, you'll see where it lists other birth and death records. Some are periodicals for Lafourche Parish, and they're in the Terrebonne Lifelines that we have here. Baton Rouge and Shreveport, we had talked about, started in the 1870s. These are ledgers that are at the state archives. You would have to go there. You can't get this information online. But the books, if you go to a library, maybe in the library, and Judy did these. We have one on Baton Rouge that spans the years 1874 to 1918, and it's in ledger form. If you want to look at the microfilm, the important thing to remember with these, and this next series is from Shreveport, Louisiana, is that they index them as an abstract. It gives vital information like age and things like that. But if you find your ancestors in here, look at the microfilm or look at the books at a library, because there may also be other information. It's sporadic on perhaps the cause of death. So Judy, if you want to, there's so much to tell.
Well, yes.
Turn it over to you.
In addition to those, there are some that are in the online index at the state archives. There are some Jefferson Parish death certificates from the 1850s through the 1870s. There are a handful of delayed deaths. These are deaths that were recorded some years after the fact, and some of those extend back into the 1800s. And also, don't overlook the New Orleans death certificates, even if your family wasn't from New Orleans. They may have lived in the area and have gone, because there were hospitals there, they may have gone and died in the hospital. So don't overlook those. I have an example here of someone, Lucien Uzé from Lafourche Parish, who had moved to Algiers just 2 years before he died, and he has a death certificate. Now you see this one's a little bit different. It's from the 1890s, and it doesn't have quite as much information on it as some of the later ones do.
Oh, you were talking in terms of charity hospital. Well, you talked about hospitals, but in the state of Louisiana, with charity being what it was, even in the 1700s, it was the King's Hospital. And so as it moved into the statewide and as time progressed, charity had so many people that went there for illnesses that would die there.
Right.
So it's very...
so don't overlook
very,
the New
yeah, very
Orleans
significant.
death certificates.
And we haven't seen a birth certificate. Do you have an
Right,
example?
I have an
real quick,
example
and then we're gonna
of a birth
close
certificate.
down real quick.
This is from 1883. The child's name was John Alfred Gaymar, and it gives his parents' names. He was the lawful son of John Gaymar and Sarah Ann Nero. And the informant on this was Florestine Nero. It doesn't say on here, but that was the child's grandmother, who is the one who went and gave the information for the birth certificate. Also, it tells you the father was a native of this city, and he was 25 years old. His occupation was gardener. Sarah Ann Nero was a native of Louisiana. She was from Iberville Parish, though it doesn't say it on here, and she was aged 25 years old. So you'll get pretty good details from the birth certificates for New Orleans. Unfortunately, we don't have as many birth certificates for the state of Louisiana. You mentioned some of those in the Baton Rouge and Shreveport books. We're just now starting to get access to the statewide birth certificates at the state archives. The earliest ones I've seen are dated 1911. That's because we have the 100-year rule,
100
and they're
years.
just starting to come
want 'em.
in. So you'll see a handful for certain parishes, not all parishes, but for certain parishes do go back to 1911.
Very good. And in this particular show, we've looked at civil marriages, civil births and civil deaths. We have not really touched upon the marriages. But the marriages are not at the state archives, they're at courthouses. So we'll be doing a segment on courthouse research, and when we do, then we'll talk about the civil marriages and the types of records that exist with that. Next week's show, however, will be on the church vital records, which are a different take. It's governed by church rules, and we'll be going into that just like we did here. In that show, we will, however, cover marriages, so it will be births, marriages, deaths for church records, mainly Catholic church records, but also some of the other Protestant churches in and around the state of Louisiana.